behind the scenes at NIWA, University of Auckland, University of Canterbury, infrastructure owners and operators, and a couple of different consultancies as well, all contributing to the project. So I threw these slides together. The project's coming to an end. These aren't necessarily the final results, so take some of these with a grain of salt. The trends and things are still the same, but the absolute values, I suppose, will be a little bit different as we start refining those in the next couple of weeks and those final papers. Find my mouse. All right, here we go. So as part of this project, there were two main work packages. The first one, National Coastal Hazard Flood Maps, so across a range of return periods, sea level rise increments from 0, which is current day, out to 200 centimetres or plus 2 metres sea level rise in 10 centimetre increments. These flood maps are published at various resolutions from 2 metre, so the more accurate 2 metre, out to about 10 metre resolution based on areas of interest, for example, urban areas, or where there's sufficient LiDAR or case studies that we want to look at. We have a bit more detailed data and various representations of protection structures. So LiDAR data isn't always going to pick up every single seawall, every single bump in the topography. So that might act as some sort of coastal barrier. Likewise, it's not picking up the exact height of assets above the ground level. All right, so a huge range of assumptions there we have to make in terms of translating this to infrastructure, which is the main crux of what we're talking about today. In the infrastructure space, we're taking all these flood hazard maps, looking at the direct exposure and damage, so normal risk modelling that you might be familiar with, the indirect exposure, so incorporating interdependencies into our network models, and applying these across a range of case studies. So looking at the direct and indirect at the national scale, which is what I'm more interested in today, but we've also done case studies in the Auckland area, Christchurch, and Dunedin papers all published. So our case studies, we use the full suite of these coastal flood maps. The ones that are published online are the bolded. My last check, it's only the 100-year return period with current day sea level rise that you can download yourselves. Okay, the reason for that is above my pay grade, so I'm not going to try and defend either way. But in all of these case studies that you see, we use the full suite. Yeah, I'll leave it there for what the public can access themselves and download to recreate these. In terms of recreation, we use open data in our models to create different network models. So we have 10 different infrastructure network models. Here we're focusing on 5 or 6 that are a bit more relevant to the coastal regions, across electricity through to fuel and road networks. So they're all based on open data, things we don't have to sign for, or models we've made ourselves to create simplifications of all these networks. So these aren't every single asset, every single edge that exists, but a simplification of those. So some of these networks are modeled quite straightforward. Fuel supply, for example, you've got a supply point, you've got a destination, origin destination. Is there a connection between those two? Yes or no? It's like a simple accessibility problem. Whereas you get down to the far end down here with transmission and electricity, where we need to use things like power flow models because it becomes very sensitive. Can't use topological models. Things like an impact down at a generation plant in the South Island can have effects across the whole island. So we need to add a bit more sophistication into this side here. Water and wastewater, somewhere in the middle. They're quite isolated or separated little networks. So a bit easier to manage those topologically. Okay, straight into some results. I'm going to pick on Transpower today. So 100-year exposure is the kind of things that we are typically looking at with many of these risk assessments, looking at the 100-year. The graph here, we've got sea level rise in centimetres across the x-axis, and across the y-axis, the number of assets exposed. So what we're looking at here, Transpower highlighted quite nicely. is that we have a certain number that are getting wet already, that are already exposed to this. Some of them are already designed for that. They're crossing estuaries and things, that's all right, but they're still exposed to the hazard. And so within the first 20, 30, 40 centimetres of sea level rise, we don't see much more additional exposure. So here it's about one pole or one transmission tower per 16 millimetres sea level rise. And then from there, it starts accelerating these assets that are slightly removed from the coast when you're getting up to some serious sea level rise. The red line here being substations. So substations are relatively either well protected already or situated far enough away from the coast, these transmission substations, to about 60, 70 centimetres, where you start seeing these start getting affected. So quite a lot of time, I suppose, up our sleeves for this one, but in terms of long-term planning of transmission infrastructure, very expensive to build these substations. Any renewal, we need to start focusing on these ones at the lower end here and highlighting some of those at-risk assets. In comparison, I won't go through all of them, but zone substations and water supply nodes that are represented in our model lie somewhere in between. So you're getting about one more zone substation for every 40 centimetres of sea level rise, and one more water supply asset. It could be a pump, a reservoir treatment plant, an intake for every 24 centimetres from there. So highlighting the fact that these are just the assets that we've got modelled. This is not all assets in the country. These are ones that are open data, so the ones that we have full access to model there. Looking at this spatially, I just exported a couple of GIFs here, looking at 10-year, 100-year, and 1,000-year. These are mesh blocks getting highlighted when they're losing service to any of those infrastructures that we've previously looked at. So from direct exposure, direct disruptions. And so generally, the way to look at it, you could unpick these for hours. The idea is you see areas that are getting affected by the 1,000-year flood at a certain sea level rise increment. Then these are reflected in the 100-year at a higher sea level rise increment, and so on with the 10-year. So you see them flicking across. And when we get a couple more here, we see that paintbrush swooping across the South Island. That's when the bulk supply points, the fuel supply points at our ports become inundated. And then all of a sudden, we have no redundancies available in the rest of the country for delivering fuel. So that's why the whole country, all the mesh blocks in there, have no access to any fuel supply. Just that. So these are based on a huge range of assumptions, but this is the scenario we're looking at the moment there. So as well as geographic disruptions, annualized exposure is a good or interesting from the research perspective. So annualized losses, here we're looking at the annualized exposure, so the number of assets we can expect in 1 year to be wet for different sea level rise increments, and then how that's reflected in terms of the number of people that could be affected. And so what we're seeing here, basically the slope of this line is the extra number of assets per centimetre that we can expect to be exposed per year. I just realised earlier that the axis is incorrect for the electricity. Orange line here, it should be a different axis, about 6 times as high, but the shape of the curve is still the same. These numbers are right. You're starting off with about extra 62 poles or towers per year getting exposed across our electricity networks, increasing after about 20 centimetres of sea level rise, sudden huge increase, and then plateauing again. And we see this across all our networks, a lot of them between that 20, 30, 40 centimetre range of sea level rise. We're quite well equipped for the amount of sea level rise in terms of our exposure, but from there, this is when it really accelerates. So we have a little bit of time on our hands in one sense, but then we are building infrastructure to last longer, or to last across these timeframes. So we need to start really taking note of those parts and where these tipping points are. Again, this is assuming a stationary climate. The problem we always have here is that by the time we have 20 centimetres of sea level rise across the country, the climate or the distribution, statistical distribution of our hazards won't be the same as well. So we could expect that this may shift to the left or accelerate even faster. Often we look at assets as well, the disruption, the number of assets damaged, a completely different picture when you start looking at what it actually means for people. So wastewater networks, we see the number of people potentially affected accelerates far faster than any of the other networks. Electricity networks, these here, and the water supply at the bottom here, often it's the last mile, we could say, right? So these more remote areas, bringing in the electricity poles and things like that along little coastal roads, getting to communities that are actually affecting them in terms of their access and their infrastructure supplies. So looking at asset statistics alone, just looking at exposure of assets is a bit misleading in terms of the actual number of people affected. But then we still have to look at those detailed case studies in those areas where the assets are affected to see what that means in terms of not just service, but access as well, which I understand you're doing work on. And to summarize there on the interdependency side of things, these graphs here, we have sea level rise as per usual on the X, and the Y we have the population affected. So the solid line being the combination of direct and indirect, the dotted line just being those direct. So just flooding of an asset would be a direct damage. Direct and indirect is via interdependencies, loss of electricity, loss of a route, transport route, or something like that. And so, depending on the networks and the return periods you're looking at it, in the coastal hazard space, the main driver of these disruptions is the direct damage, so the direct flooding. When we're looking at the network more generally and looking at being hazard agnostic, just looking at the properties of our networks in New Zealand, we see it's a bit more even, right? So coastal hazards, direct disruptions, what we say here then are all driving the damage. And the wastewater networks as well, we could explain the intricacies of this graph, but the idea again in the wastewater network, they're quite centralized, going to wastewater treatment plants, often on the coast, for easy access to outfalls. And so the direct disruptions to those are really the key drivers, where if you're looking more generally across all hazards, across the wider country, it's often lack of electricity or lack of road network connection is what disrupts wastewater networks more so than damage directly to them, because they can take advantage of gravity and the like. So what? Well, without throwing numbers at you, so comparatively, project what we're looking at, disruptions are relatively well constrained to the coastal hazard zone, so close to where the actual event is taking place. This could be a couple of things. We've got sufficient redundancies. Many infrastructure networks, electricity networks and road networks often designed for redundancies, but it could also be a good case of a long-term planning, citing these key infrastructure assets that causing or central to these cascading failures being well planned and slightly removed from the coast, either distance-wise or elevated. Generally, we see in the coastal space here, and generally more direct disruptions, so rather than indirect or via interdependencies. What this means is that each of these infrastructure networks, depending in a national sense, have a bit more focus on robustness, building up the robustness of their own networks, rather than trying to integrate redundancies from other ones. We still have a long way to go in terms of data accessibility and suitability. So we can, I'm sure we're all singing from the same song sheet there about data availability. So there's no way, while this highlights key areas to look at, we can't avoid undertaking localized case studies for when it gets to actually down to adaptation planning. I would love to have all singing or dancing model so we can do adaptation at the national scale. But unfortunately, that's not a case for now or the the near future. And then finally, what we often see in the standards and the policy documents and things like that in the coastal space is about avoiding adapting in silos, not considering the wider implications. So infrastructure dependencies in this case, or accessibility to communities and things, are only one aspect of this. This also extends, that we are running the risk of doing here, is not considering other hazards, the other competing objectives that our infrastructure owners and operators have as well. So follow-on work from this project, and in parallel, we're doing lots looking at multi-hazards, so different kinds of hazards. So 2024 is the year of hazard data sets, used data sets for hazards for tsunamis, for fluvial flooding, landslides, liquefaction, and the like. And some of that expressed in a student project here, looking at residential damage to multi-hazard risk, a little viewer, if that's what you're interested in. Okay. Hopefully I stayed close enough within time. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you so much. That was really, really helpful and really interesting. At least from the adaptation team, I think we were all nerdily excited. Did anyone have any like super burning questions for Conrad right now, or are you okay to save them till the end?
Yep, I can throw my email address in the chat anyway.
Okay.
Might be easier as well to explain a bit more behind some of the questions. Yep.
Yep. And when will your report? You said your findings weren't.
The National Road study will be the next couple of weeks. That's the first one, and then the findings from that are used in our national interdependencies model as well. So I think it's the end of next month is the end of the whole project from memory. So these ones are the next couple of weeks refining the final outputs and things.
Cool. Right.
Yep.
All right. So if there are no questions just yet, we'll hand over to Andrew. Sounds good. Yep.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Ellison, and I'm a coastal adaptation scientist at NIWA. And what I'm going to talk about today is an overview of a project which we finished back in March. It's a 3.5-year project called Adaptive Tools for Decisions on Compound Climate Change Hazards on Water Infrastructure. Basically, it's about applying decision-making under deep uncertainty tools to inform infrastructure adaptation in New Zealand. And it's got a number of people on the project team from NIWA, also Judy Lawrence, who's, I know, one of the climate change commissioners, Jan Kwakel, who's a professor at Delft Technical University in the Netherlands, Adolf Strombergen, who's an economist at Informametrics in Wellington. So sea level rise is a chronic ongoing condition or change that will affect lots of communities in low-lying coastal situations. We know this. And also we have extreme events, effectively, with uncertain magnitude and frequency that could impact at any time, and those are made worse by relative sea level rise. So infrastructure providers' jobs is to service these communities, but they face difficult choices about how to adapt infrastructure and when. So it's sometimes difficult to identify adaptation thresholds, which is when current actions or proposed future actions may no longer meet their objectives. And it's also sometimes hard to identify how long it could take to plan, consult on, and implement new adaptive actions for infrastructure. And that process determines how far in advance you need to make a decision to adapt. So in this project, we developed a 7-step methodology that allows infrastructure providers and decision makers to reduce some of that deep uncertainty and to better understand the systems they need to manage. These boxes down the bottom show the order in which the 7 steps should generally be used, but that can change due to the circumstances of each application. So the 2 acronyms here are for DAP, Dynamic Adaptive Pathways Planning, and RDM, which is Robust Decision Making. They're kind of core tools I'll talk about here. So effectively, the methodology combines workshops, systems mapping, DAP, simulation or exploratory modeling, robust decision making, and an economic analysis to develop and stress test adaptation plans for specific assets. This approach doesn't have to be completed in isolation. You can leverage existing work that's either done or planned by an organization. So, for example, one of our 2 case studies picked up an existing DAP plan, which had been developed for a Helensville wastewater treatment plant, and we effectively tested when the actions in that DAP would need to be completed by in order to be effective. So these 7 methods can be applied to develop and stress test an adaptation plan for basically any kind of coastal infrastructure. So while our project focuses on wastewater, we're now applying this methodology for freshwater adaptation and for assessing the lifespan of transport networks, including state highways. So a quick overview of DAP, although I'm sure you're fairly familiar. DAP's used for anticipating risk, but we need to make decisions today to avoid lock-in of maladaptation. So risks change over time, and increasing flexibility is needed to adopt different outcomes and actions. So DAP's recommended by the Ministry for the Environment, Coastal Hazards and Climate Change guidance for local government, no longer called for local government. So finding a way to implement DAP is important, but the big challenge is identifying those adaptation thresholds and lead times required. And for robust decision making, while a DAP offers a range of actions and options that could be followed, it doesn't really explicitly show which sequences of actions are robust, so that will meet multiple competing objectives that infrastructure providers need to meet under a wide array of different possible futures. So that's climate futures, socioeconomic futures, demand futures. So robust decision making, it's an approach that considers multiple different futures. It seeks robust rather than optimal strategies. It employs adaptive strategies to achieve robustness, and it simulates these via modeling. So rather than being about optimization and finding the best pathway under a single climate scenario, that focuses on finding the pathway or pathways that are least likely to fail across all the future possible scenarios. So basically the pathways that are least likely to fail regardless of what might happen in the future. And in this project, we used RDM to stress test 2 DAPs for 2 different wastewater treatment plants on low-lying coastal plains to see how they performed under a range of different climate change and influence scenarios. On the left there, we have the Seaview wastewater treatment plant, which is effectively wastewater provision for the entire Hutt Valley area. Services, I think, 130,000 properties. And on the right, the Helensville plant in North Auckland, which services 8,000. It's basically 2 orders of magnitude smaller when you're talking about influent volumes, but they're both located, as you can see by those pictures, very low lying, only a few tens of centimeters above sea level. The Helensville plant in particular is susceptible to fluvial hazards as well as coastal. And basically, we needed to stress test these. It was a compound hazard study. So we looked at coastal, fluvial, and pluvial hazards. And we forced the models. So I developed cellular automata models for each of these sites. So those models are basically spatially explicit, temporally dynamic. So they show space and they run over time. And I forced them with combinations of RCP scenarios, or SSPs for the second one, as they now are, influence scenarios, and manual and automatic implementation of the DAP plans for each plant. So the models simulate the implementation of the DAP when new actions are chosen, when triggers are reached, and they're reached and applied in order to try to avoid those adaptation thresholds. We run Monte Carlo analyses on these models. So basically run the models tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of times to understand all the possible outcomes. And through that process, we can determine the feasibility of different adaptive actions and different adaptation pathways. And we can identify the lifespan of the assets under different scenarios. So that's the plant, the trunk network, and the outfall pipelines. So the next couple of slides, I'll talk to the Petone Seaview plant case study. So we ran a Monte Carlo analysis of 150,000 iterations on that model to identify what combinations of adaptive actions were successful at allowing the plant to remain on site until 2100 and beyond. That plant's current design life is until 2080. So we identified 5 robust strategies that would allow this, with the timing of implementation of different adaptive actions determined by the rate of sea level rise. That is one caveat with this work here, is that we assumed no change in storminess or no change in the increasing frequency and magnitude of storms over time. What we found, though, is there was not actually a lot of dynamism in the resulting pathways. So while it was possible to switch between two of these different archetypes, overall, the stress testing of this model showed that the range of actions that could actually meet all of Wellington Water's operational and performance objectives was limited. That may go counter to what a DAP is, a dynamic plan, but it's also a useful finding in itself because it shows that some of the other actions that were proposed in that DAP plan were not actually fit for purpose. They weren't robust and they weren't actually going to be functional under a full suite of climate and influence scenarios. And after we had some robust pathways, we did an economics analysis on this. Adolf Strombergen from Infometrics did that. He used a modified form of real options analysis to identify the cost of inaction and delayed action, so delayed implementation of different actions in the pathways. Basically, it showed that delaying or trying to delay retreat by implementing incremental actions actually ended up to be more expensive than transformational change. So by transformational change, we mean picking up those hundreds of millions of dollars of assets of the plant and moving them offsite. And that's counter to traditional thinking around the high costs of managed retreat, which we know will be expensive, but it turns out, as you can imagine, trying to fight against nature is pretty futile in the long term. So on the other side of this project, as an adaptation scientist, it's rare to get a real-life demonstration of our work. So we know that climate change is here and now, but most of our work really does focus on the future. So for us, a real-life demonstration of our work showed that the model performed very well in simulating major events and eventually led to us being asked to provide guidance on implementing this methodology more widely. So as you know, last January, Auckland had a 1 in 220-year flood event, the most expensive non-earthquake event in the history of New Zealand until 3 weeks later when Cyclone Gabrielle came through. But it was about 3 months since we'd finished the modelling for the Auckland plant, and the Helensville wastewater treatment plant ended up behaving basically exactly as our model suggested it would. So the Kaipara River burst its banks upstream from Helensville. It inundated large areas of farmland, but the peak river flows coincided with the lower portion of the tidal cycle, at least not the peak of the high tide. So the plant was not overtopped by combined river flows and surge. But the influent volumes into a fairly elderly pipe network were so high that even though Watercare had just, and I mean 2 months earlier, completed upgrades to the plant, which increased the wastewater processing capacity by 50%, the upgrades were still insufficient to deal with the amount of influent pouring into that pipe network. So mobile pumps had to be brought in on the back of trucks to lower the pond level and effectively discharge partially treated effluent into the Kaipara River. Luckily, the river flows were so high that even when the tide was incoming, the river was taking it out to sea. So it didn't affect the town in that sense. So yeah, raw sewage or untreated, partially treated sewage was discharged into the harbour, and that happened at 11 plants around Auckland. And at one point, my local stream was running with 10% raw sewage. So not ideal. So findings of this research, effectively the 7 methods that we implemented allowed for holistic, accurate and robust modelling and analysis of extreme events and their impacts on assets. We found that we could identify specific increments of relative sea level rise under which specific pieces of infrastructure in the network will be exposed to a range of different coastal hazards. The combination of DAP and robust decision making gives a process through which adaptation actions can be stress tested, and that gives decision makers more certainty on their viability and longevity on site. And through this process, lock-in and path dependency can be avoided. And that the real key here is that this process can give greater uncertainty to decision makers and asset managers under conditions of deep uncertainty where we don't know exactly how fast climate change is going to occur or sea level rise will occur, but it gives us the opportunity to resolve some of that uncertainty by rendering it void. So as I say, our project's just finished about 2-3 weeks ago, and I believe 2 days ago, our guidance for infrastructure providers was released. So that's the link there, and that is effectively a way of implementing or applying this process that fits within the Ministry for the Environment's 10-step planning cycle for any kind of coastal or low-lying infrastructure. Effectively now, we're working on a next step, which is outside the Deep South project, which is identifying equitable adaptation strategies and pathways. So we know that in a lot of adaptation processes, social diversity is not accounted for. There's a lot of people who can't go to adaptation meetings in the evenings or in the weekends. And so we're finding a way to incorporate people whose opinions are missing from the decision-making practices into adaptation decision-making. We've got a smart idea bid in with MB, and we'll find out about that in a few months' time. And we're partnering with councils and the Ministry for the Environment on that bid. And thank you. Happy to take any questions on that.
Cool. Thank you so much, Andrew. Were there any questions on that one?
I had one. Oh, that was really fascinating. Thanks. Particularly, I live really close to the Seaview wastewater treatment plant. I've often wondered, like, you know, they take so many short-term decisions because there was that music festival.
Hold on. Sorry, 1 second. Andrew, can you hear the question? You can. Okay.
So they take lots of short-term decisions about whether to upgrade because there's that terrible smell and so basically, will your tools be able to support councils to make different financial decisions? Because I think there's that whole political economy thing around like the transformational investment's the best thing to do, but the finances and like how did you work together with the councils on that? I know that's like more like a social economic factor, but yeah. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, trying to manage the room with 4 people in it. So we partnered with Wellington Water on this rather than the regional councils. This was effectively the first implementation of these 7 methods and combined anywhere in the world. We've combined some of them before in the Netherlands, but not here. So this was a case study rather than developing an adaptation plan for implementation. We are now in the process of negotiating to apply this for other wastewater treatment plants. But what we didn't take into account, as I said, some of those social and the economic elements of how this could actually be funded. And there are drivers that could lead a water infrastructure provider to leave that plant on site for longer, because when we did the initial testing of that CV model, it turned out that none of the actions we had in the DAP would actually allow it to remain on site for the design life. When we took those results back to Wellington Water, they said, well, actually, there are some options that we could implement that could allow it to remain on site. For example, increasing the height, elevation of some of the electrical and pumping systems, which would mean that even if there was a bit of nuisance flooding, the plant would still be operable. So we added those into the DAP and stress tested those actions again to see if they would work, and it turns out they would. But yes, as I say, it's a case study rather than an implementable plan at this project stage. So the question was around whether the real life stress test of the Helensville event changed the way Watercare is managing the plant. And yes and no. We ran this process parallel to Watercare developing an adaptation plan for that plant. But they basically finished at the same time. And Watercare had made the decision to upgrade the plant so that it would be able to last for 25 years on site and then need to be moved after that. But they have decided to bring that forward slightly. Not a huge amount, because they still need to be able to provide wastewater services for that community. And it's not up to me to speak on behalf of Watercare as to what their exact strategy is, but the strategy is available online if people are interested. But yes, the plant they're aware, and that's partly why they approached us to partner with us for this project, that they knew it was going to need to be moved at some stage. And we were able to give them certainty to basically let them know that, yes, their decision was a good one, a robust decision to make a decision to move the plant.
Okay, any more questions before we move on to Kenny? All right, I think he's ready, so I'll hand over to Kenny.
All right, kia ora. Thanks, Shilpa. Give me a thumbs up if I'm coming through. I think I am. Yep. So I'm going to be talking about risk-based flood insurance. So what does that mean? So people have insurance on their homes, residential insurance, for the most part, until very recently. That sort of flood component of that was basically the same across lots of different properties and not really related to a dwelling's individualized risk. And risk-based flood insurance uses modeling to really localize that risk and price flood insurance accordingly. So this is with colleagues who all of us were at Manaki Whenua when this project started, and one of us remains there. And so EPA, Patrick's at EPA, Sea Lies independent like me now. Is this working? So, as I said, modelling now allows flood risk to be priced into insurance contracts. So there's a commercial provider of flood modelling, RMS, that provides the service to insurers now. And so it's nice modelling. It's 50,000 years of simulated data, good probabilistic model, good spatial detail. You can buy it if you're willing to pay for it. Likewise, NIWA, as Conrad mentioned, have this nice coastal flood model, which provides sort of enough information to get similar results for coastal flooding. Our research question is trying to answer if the insurance sector as a whole were to move from full risk sharing, which is more or less the status quo, to fully risk-based premiums, how would different groups be affected? So talking about different ethnic groups, different income groups, trying to think about what are those social implications of this sort of looming move to risk-based flood insurance. So what we try and do is we try and come up with a flood premium for every household in the country, covering both inland and coastal flooding. So we get housing characteristics from homes.co.nz for residential properties, do some modelling to try and refine those locations using Lynn's building outlines so that the dot's actually in the right place. And then most of the heavy lifting is done by the scientists. So RMS and NIWA have their own models of both flood risk and damage. And so we flick them the homes data set and they give us back a data set of average annualized loss, or one of these actuarially fair insurance premiums, which represents, roughly speaking, what you would need to charge a person to, on average, not make any money out of them nor lose any money out of them from the insurance perspective. Right. So how do we do the equity bit? So we try and, sort of the goal is to try and figure out what types of people live in every house. That data are not available in any way. So what we have to do is we have to take census data on demographics and income, things like that, and try and generate synthetic microdata, which roughly represents the distribution of those variables across space. Won't talk about how we do that, but it is important that you do that. You can't just use the group averages and expect to get a good result. The first sort of model we run to try and have a first look at the equity stuff is just a linear regression, looking at the basic relationships between flood premiums and demographic variables, and then we use these Oaxaca decompositions to understand how any burden gap is related to other variables. So it's sort of decomposes the Māori non-Māori gap, for example, into things related to other variables. And very simple representation of what is bad. So if your flood premium is greater than $500, you're considered bad. If it's below that, then it's not so bad. All right, some disclaimers: don't sue me or RMS or Manaki Whenua. Don't sue me or RMS, or NIWA or Manaki Whenua. Here on this plot is a just graph of the distribution of these flood premiums. Looks nice and normal, except when you see that the x-axis is a log scale. So this graph is telling us that these flood risk, or these simulated flood premiums, is extremely right skewed. So I've put in some annotations to help people read this, because it's very hard to read log x scale density plot. So about 10% of dwellings, or say 90% of dwellings, have a very low flood premium. So $40, 90% would be below that. About 10% are in that $40 to $1,800 range, or about 9%, sorry. About 1% are in the $1,700 to $33,000 range, and 1 in 1,000 are above $33,000 per year. Just for a bit of context, an annual median rent is about $30,000 in this country. So basically 1 in 1,000 properties are rendered worthless if this flood insurance premium scheme, this policy, were to come into force. Basic results for equity. So Māori, we find more likely, 35% more likely to have a high flood insurance premium. High deprivation households are more likely to have a higher flood insurance premium than low deprivation. There's a similar number for income. We just show the deprivation number here. Region, urban, rural, also important. But importantly, the variation is immense. So, and it's really down to dwelling variation. Socio-demographic variables actually explain very little of the variation. It's less than 1% of the variation. So just keep going. Another thing that we did was we tried to map where quote-unquote vulnerable areas are. So these are places where there's a significant proportion of households with both high deprivation and high flood risk. So the units there on the right. Concentrations in Northland, Coromandel. I was surprised not to see sort of big circles in Westland and Tairāwhiti. I think this is what this is telling us, is that actually flood risk is much more widespread than what we see on the news. So the places that have flooded are not necessarily the places that will flood. And so it is actually pretty widespread, the risk. So what does it mean? So flood risk is very household specific. So it really does change from house to house on a street. It's really local. Accordingly, any sort of policy support that a government were to put in would have to be at that level of individual detail, dwelling level detail. So it's it's fine enough to say Māori are overrepresented here, as well as in many other statistics. But any support for flood risk, it's really got to be down to that household level. And ideally, if budget is an issue, and I'm sure it is, targeting those high deprivation areas or households. All right, I have maybe 1 minute to keep talking about some of those gaps. So I'll just show you one more graph at the end here. So this is sort of a decomposition of the Māori non-Māori gap. And the things to highlight from this graph is really that the reason Māori are overrepresented in these sort of high flood risk, high flood premium places is because Māori tend to be in regions that are more exposed. So that's Northland, Te Tairāwhiti, as well as it's also related to income in the statistical decomposition. So I'll stop there and get questions. I have to turn my sound on. I can't hear anyone yet. Sound should be on.
So this is more a policy question, but what is the driver for insurance firms moving from the so from the risk sharing model to risk based? Shouldn't there be a difference between the two approaches? Because you're just setting the premium at a different level, right?
That's right. So the economic driver is there's a big first mover advantage. So an insurance company is incentivized to get the high risk off their books. As in, if there's full risk sharing, then there are properties where if an insurance company were to lose them, they'd be happy about that and make more money. So there's big first mover advantage, especially to moving to risk-based pricing. I'm surprised it hasn't happened already. This data set has been out for a couple of years. Tower made an announcement that they're going to start doing it over a year ago. IAG recently made an announcement that they're going to do it. We haven't seen widespread loss of insurance, nor people turning up at stuff and saying my insurance bill is $33,000 now. So yeah,
Health sector.
Say that again.
Couldn't you make the same argument for the health sector? And isn't it risk? So the former, isn't it risk sharing in the health sector rather than risk based?
In the public health sector, you mean?
The private insurance health insurance market.
Yeah. Same incentives are there for private insurance. I think the sort of, I don't know the institutions well enough to tell you why that hasn't happened for health. I mean, for the private market, they say no pre-existing conditions, and so that's essentially saying we're not going to take on additional risk we don't know about, that we know about.
Thank you.
The government must be quite concerned if this is introduced, given that they would then effectively become the insurer of default.
Agree.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So we did a little bit of engagement with Treasury, who were doing some work for Grant Robertson to try and figure out the merits of a public flood insurance program similar to EQC. My understanding of that is that was deemed not worth it, not necessary. So. Yeah, no, I think absolutely right. I think the government does step in some circumstances after flooding occurs, but in this case, this is a policy change before flooding occurs. Rachel.
Yeah, kind of just on that, I was just thinking, like, in a sense, is this kind of thing, I guess in the most extreme cases, these aren't good places to live, right? Where you have super high flood risk. I don't know. And so I kind of wonder if, like, at those more extreme ends, does this help incentivize actually not building in these places and actually moving out so that people aren't in the riskier places?
That's right. Huge benefit to sort of incentivize stopping building in really high risk places with this sort of policy. But I mean, my view is that councils should be banning that sort of stuff already. That you shouldn't need risk-based flood insurance pricing to make that happen. We've got the modelling. Councils are supposed to have the modelling. They should just stop giving building consents in the 1% floodplain. Yeah, that's my view. And there's a lot of places there already, and more to come, as Conrad's sea level rise stuff would indicate.
Zoe, you've got that online question.
They want to answer it or not.
Yeah, I'll read it out. It's okay. Does the data just look at risk to individual properties, or also for suburbs infrastructure is at risk? No, that's Conrad's job. So just residential properties in my one.
Yeah, when you're getting down to the suburb level, you would want to be using a more detailed hydraulic model of impacts at the suburb level. Hydraulics of stormwater networks and overland flow paths get quite complicated really fast when you're looking in urban areas. So yeah, hence the need for these detailed studies.
Maybe I'll just jump and ask a quick question there then. Are there any plans to do any sort of cross between the type of work you've been doing, Conrad, which is more about service provision, and then more detailed modelling, and the work you've done, Kenny, about demographics of those affected?
Great idea.
Yeah,
no,
there's
plans.
So we have students at University of Canterbury that look at this kind of stuff, accessibility and access to services and things like that. And there was some work in Wellington as well. So there's, yeah, in the research space, not so much, but it's more urban intelligence in Canterbury do, who obviously we work with closely. Look a bit more about the application of this research, I suppose, at that stage.
Yeah, and I'm happy to hand over the synthetic census data to anyone who wants to sort of have a fake data set of where different types of people live.
Also, just drawing attention to Kate's just dropped something in the chat, which is a podcast series done last year, which answers some of those questions you were raising, Rachel. It's a really good question, really key question.
Are there any more questions? I think that's it. Is that it? I think so. All right. Well, thank you so much to the group here and Conrad Online. We're all, in case you guys missed it, we're all in a room at NIWA in Auckland with Nancy here as well. So it's the first time we've been able to see some real people. So it's been nice. So it's been great to see you guys in real life. And so I will just close off with the karakia. And then we can all go to the next meetings for the rest of the day. Hare iroto I te maramatanga. Hare iroto I te rangamarie. Tukua toa wairua. Kia tau te rangamarie. Kia tato katua ho paimari. Thank you very much. And if you guys need to ask Andrew or Conrad or Kenny any more questions, is it okay if we share your email addresses and things around you? Cool. All right. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.